The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 14. The Supra-Rational Beauty. Religion is the seeking after the spiritual, the supra-rational, and therefore in this sphere the intellectual reason may well be an insufficient help, and find itself not only at the end, but from the beginning, out of its province, and condemned to tread, either diffidently, or else with a stumbling presumptuousness, in the realm of a power and a light higher than its own. But in the other spheres of human consciousness and human activity, it may be thought that it has the right to the sovereign place, since these move on the lower plane of the rational and the infinite, or belong to that borderland where the rational and the infrarational meet, and the impulses and the instincts of man stand in need, above all, of the light and the control of the reason. In its own sphere of finite knowledge, science, philosophy, the useful arts, its right, one would think, must be indisputable. But this does not turn out in the end to be true. Its province may be larger, its powers more ample, its action more justly self-confident. But in the end, everywhere, it finds itself standing between the two other powers of our being, and fulfilling, in greater or less degree, the same function of an intermediary. On one side, it is an enlightener, not always the chief enlightener, and the corrector of our life impulses and first mental seekings. On the other, it is only one minister of the veiled spirit, and a preparer of the paths for the coming of its rule. This is especially evident in the two realms which in the ordinary scale of our powers stand nearest to the reason, and on either side of it, the aesthetic and the ethical being, the search for beauty and the search for good. Man's seeking after beauty reaches its most intense and satisfying expression in the great creative arts, poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture. But in its full extension, there is no activity of his nature or his life from which need or ought to be excluded, provided we understand beauty both in its widest and its truest sense. A complete and universal appreciation of beauty, and the making entirely beautiful our whole life, and being, must surely be a necessary character of the perfect individual and the perfect society. But in its origin, this seeking for beauty is not rational. It springs from the roots of our life. It is an instinct and an impulse, an instinct of aesthetic satisfaction and an impulse of aesthetic creation and enjoyment. Starting from the infrarational parts of our being, this instinct and impulse begin with much imperfection and impurity, and with great crudities, both in creation and in appreciation. It is here that reason comes in to distinguish, to enlighten, to correct, to point out the deficiencies and the crudities, to lay down laws of aesthetics, and to purify our appreciation and our creation by improved taste and right knowledge. While we are thus striving to learn and correct ourselves, it may seem to be the true lawgiver, both for the artist and the admirer, and though not the creator of our aesthetic instinct and impulse, yet the creator in us of an aesthetic conscience, and its vigilant judge and guide. That which was an obscure and erratic activity, it makes self-conscious and rationally discriminative in its work and enjoyment. But again, this is true only in restricted bounds, or, if anywhere entirely true, then only on a middle plane of our aesthetic seeking and activity, where the greatest and most powerful creation of beauty is accomplished, and its appreciation and enjoyment rise to the highest pitch. The rational is always surpassed and left behind. The creation of beauty in poetry and art does not fall within the sovereignty or even within the sphere of the reason. The intellect is not the poet, the artist, the creator within us. Creation comes by a suprarational influx of light and power, which must work always, if it is to do its best, by vision and inspiration. It may use the intellect for certain of its operations, but in proportion as it subjects itself to the intellect, it loses in power and force of vision, and diminishes the splendor and the truth of the beauty it creates. The intellect may take hold of the influx, moderate and repress the divine enthusiasm of creation, and force it to obey the prudence of its dictates. But in doing so, it brings down the work to its own inferior level, and the lowering is in proportion to the intellectual interference. For by itself, the intelligence can only achieve talent, though it may be a high and even, if sufficiently helped from above, a surpassing talent. Genius, the true creator, is always supra-rational in its nature and its instrumentation, even when it seems to be doing the work of the reason. It is most itself, most exalted in its work, most sustained in the power, depth, height, and beauty of its achievement, when it is least touched by, least mixed with any control of the mere intellectuality, and least often drops from its heights of vision and inspiration into reliance upon the always mechanical process of intellectual construction. Art creation, which accepts the canons of the reason and works within the limits laid down by it, may be great, beautiful, and powerful. For genius can preserve its power even when it labors in shackles and refuses to put forth all its resources. But when it proceeds by means of the intellect, it constructs, but does not create. It may construct well, and with a good and faultless workmanship, but its success is formal and not of the spirit, a success of technique and not the embodiment of the imperishable truth of beauty, seized in its inner reality, its divine delight, its appeal to a supreme source of ecstasy, Ananda. There have been periods of artistic creation, ages of reason, in which the rational and intellectual tendency has prevailed in poetry and art. There have even been nations which, in their great formative periods of art and literature, have set up reason and a meticulous taste as the sovereign powers of their aesthetic activity. At their best, these periods have achieved work of a certain greatness, but predominantly of an intellectual greatness and perfection of technique, rather than achievements of a supreme, inspired, and revealing beauty. Indeed, their very aim has been not the discovery of the deeper truth of beauty, but truth of ideas and truth of reason, a critical rather than a true creative aim. Their leading object has been an intellectual criticism of life and nature, elevated by a consummate poetical rhythm and diction, rather than a revelation of God and man and life and nature in inspired forms of artistic beauty. But great art is not satisfied with representing the intellectual truth of things, which is always their superficial or exterior truth. It seeks for a deeper and original truth, which escapes the eye of the mere sense or the mere reason. The soul in them the unseen reality, which is not that of their form and process, but of their spirit. This it seizes and expresses by form and idea, but a significant form, which is not merely a faithful and just or a harmonious reproduction of outward nature, and a revelatory idea, not the idea which is merely correct, elegantly right, or fully satisfying to the reason and taste. Always the truth it seeks is first and foremost the truth of beauty. Not again the formal beauty alone, or the beauty of proportion and right process, which is what the sense and the reason seek, but the soul of beauty, which is hidden from the ordinary eye and the ordinary mind, and revealed in its fullness only to the unsealed vision of the poet and artist in man, who can seize the secret significances of the universal poet and artist, the divine creator, who dwells as their soul and spirit in the forms he has created. The art creation, which lays a supreme stress on reason and taste, and on perfection and purity of a technique constructed in obedience to the canons of reason and taste, claimed for itself the name of classical art. But the claim, like the too trenchant distinction on which it rests, is of doubtful validity. The spirit of the real, the great classical art and poetry, is to bring out what is universal and subordinate individual expression to universal truth and beauty, just as the spirit of romantic art and poetry is to bring out what is striking and individual, and this it often does so powerfully, or with so vivid an emphasis, as to throw into the background of its creation the universal, on which yet all true art, romantic or classical, builds and fills in its forms. In truth, all great art has carried in it both a classical and a romantic, as well as a realistic element. Understanding realism in the sense of the prominent bringing out of the external truth of things, not the perverse, inverted romanticism of the, quotes, real, end quotes, which brings into exaggerated prominence the ugly, common, or morbid, and puts that forward as the whole truth of life. The type of art to which a great creative work belongs is determined by the prominence it gives to one element and the subdual of the others into subordination to its reigning spirit. But classical art also works by a large vision and inspiration, not by the process of the intellect. The lower kind of classical art and literature, if classical it be, and not rather, as it often is, pseudo-classical, intellectually imitative of the external form and process of the classical, may achieve work of considerable, though a much lesser power, but of an essentially inferior scope and nature. For to that inferiority it is self-condemned by its principle of intellectual construction. Almost always it speedily degenerates into the formal or academic, empty of real beauty, void of life and power, imprisoned in its slavery to form, and imagining that when a certain form has been followed, certain canons of construction satisfied, certain rhetorical rules or technical principles obeyed, all has been achieved. It ceases to be art and becomes a cold and mechanical workmanship. This predominance given to reason and taste first and foremost, sometimes even almost alone, in the creation and appreciation of beauty, arises from a temper of mind which is critical rather than creative. And in regard to creation, its theory falls into a capital error. All artistic work, in order to be perfect, must indeed have, in the very act of creation, the guidance of an inner power of discrimination, constantly selecting and rejecting in accordance with the principle of truth and beauty, which remains always faithful to a harmony, a proportion, an intimate relation of the form to the idea. There is, at the same time, an exact fidelity of the idea to the spirit, nature, and inner body of the thing of beauty, which has been revealed to the soul and the mind, its svarupa and swabhava. Therefore this discriminating inner sense rejects all that is foreign, superfluous, otiose, all that is mere diversion, distractive and deformative, excessive or defective, while it selects and finds sovereignly all that can bring out the full truth, the utter beauty, the inmost power. But this discrimination is not that of the critical intellect, nor is the harmony, proportion, relation it observes that which can be fixed by any set law of the critical reason. It exists in the very nature and truth of the thing itself, the creation itself, in its secret inner law of beauty and harmony, which can be seized by vision, not by intellectual analysis. The discrimination which works in the Creator is therefore not an intellectual self-criticism or an obedience to rules imposed on him from outside by any intellectual canons, but itself creative, intuitive, a part of the vision, involved in and inseparable from the act of creation. It comes as part of that influx of power and light from above, which by its divine enthusiasm lifts the faculties into their intense suprarational working. When it fails, when it is betrayed by the lower executive instruments, rational or infrarational, and this happens when these cease to be passive and insist on obtruding their own demands or vagaries, the work is flawed, and a subsequent act of self-criticism becomes necessary. But in correcting his work, the artist who attempts to do it by rule and intellectual process uses a false, or at any rate an inferior method, and cannot do his best. He ought rather to call to his aid the intuitive critical vision and embody it in a fresh act of inspired creation, or recreation, after bringing himself back by its means into harmony with the light and law of his original creative initiation. The critical intellect has no direct or independent part in the means of the inspired creator of beauty.